Good morning, everyone. How's it going? Welcome, welcome all. More food history today. Would you like some beef tea? Or perhaps some the or perhaps would you like to know the disturbing origins of Kellogg's cornflakes? All right. Let's see what's Ooh, a lot of good stuff, but what grabs my attention? Oh yeah, airline food. Samurai food, hot chocolate from 1700s, why a tire company gives out food's most famous award. Oh yeah, the history of the potato chip. I remember that. Hot Dr. Pepper. JFK's last meal. Oof. Who was Betty Crocker? Ancient Roman pizza. Yo, let's go. You get no ad time here. Go away.
Ancient Roman pizza has recently been unearthed in Pompeii. But is it really pizza? Well, kind of, and kind of not. Either way, I am going to do my best to recreate this 2,000-year-old dish long buried beneath the ashes of Mount Vesuvius. So thank you to Babbel for sponsoring this video as we prepare Pompeian pizza, this time on Tasting History. So just a couple weeks ago, archaeologists working in Region 9 of Pompeii uncovered this fresco showing a silver tray with a leavened flatbread with toppings, along with assorted fruit and a goblet of wine. Now the style of this painting is called xenia, which comes from the Greek word that referred to a sort of social contract between hosts and guests, part of which was an offering of food to the guests, and the ancient Roman author Vitruvius wrote about this style of art in the 1st century BC. When the Greeks became more luxurious and their circumstances more opulent, they began providing dining rooms, chambers, and storerooms of provisions for their guests. And on the first day, they would invite them to dinner. This is why artists called pictures representing the things which were sent to guests xenia. So even 2,000 years ago, there was art history. So figuring out exactly what is depicted in this xenia is a little tricky. The archaeologists are fairly certain on some things like the wine, bread, pomegranate, dates, and the fruit of the strawberry tree, or corbezzolo, which is the national tree of Italy, and despite its name has nothing to do with strawberries.
Hello, Michael. Welcome in, and of course, the hydrate. One moment, please. This video is about 2,000-year-old quote-unquote pizza from Pompeii, apparently. Alright.
But then there are also some more less
Did I update Genshin? Yes, I did. Yes, I did. Gonna be playing the update this weekend.
obvious things like these items in front. Some have said that they look like mushrooms, though based on the art style, it's probably more likely that they are some sort of nut, but who really knows? Now, when it comes to the pizza and its toppings, well, it's kind of anyone's guess. Maybe that's cheese? Maybe bits of fruit? What's definitely missing is tomatoes, as those wouldn't even show up in Europe for another 1,500 years. And if there was cheese, it's very unlikely that it was anything like today's mozzarella, so while it may have some of the hallmarks of a pizza, I don't think it's going to be available for delivery anytime soon. Now, some scholars have suggested that one of the ingredients that probably is on this bread is sort of pizza-like, insofar as it is a kind of spreadable cheese, and that was called moretum. So that's what I'm going to be making today. Now, there are several ancient recipes for moretum, one of which includes pine nuts and is probably the precursor to pesto, but my favorite recipe actually comes from a poem because if you've watched this show, you know I love recipes in poetic form. The poem, often attributed to Virgil, is called, fittingly, moretum, and is really quite long, so I'm just going to read the parts that are recipe-like. Digging in the earth, he pulls up 4 heads of garlic. Then he desires the parsley's graceful foliage and the stiffness-causing rue, and trembling on their slender thread, the coriander leaf. And when he has collected these, he sits before the fire and loudly asks his wench for the mortar. The garlic bulbs he rinses and strips, then throws into the hollow stone. On these he sprinkles grains of salt, and cheese is added, then he introduces the herbs. The reeking garlic with the pestle breaks, then everything he crushes all alike. His hand in circles moves, until the ingredients lose their separate colors, and out of many colors comes one, neither wholly green nor shining white. Then drops of Athena's olive oil he adds, and pours a little of his sharp vinegar, and again works the mixture together. Like I said, there's a lot more to it, sometimes with erotic undertones.
I don't think I've ever heard of a recipe in poetic format. Oh, I think that's a first for me, hearing like a recipe for anything in poetic format.
But that is the recipe portion of the poem. Now, something interesting is that the motto on the United States Great Seal, E pluribus unum, from many one, comes from this poem. Of course, instead of referring to 13 colonies becoming one country, here it refers to the different colors of ingredients being combined to make a new color. So a little different. And it's always interesting how language can do that, you know, really be used in very different ways. Same language, very different meaning. German has a lot of these words and phrases, like Kummerspeck, which literally means grief bacon, but refers to the excess weight that you put on from emotional eating. And I'm learning different idioms like that with a little help from today's sponsor, Babbel. Babbel is one of the top language learning apps in the world, and you can get started speaking a new German word for moretum is. But regardless, this is how you make it. You'll need 2 small heads of garlic, and I know he says 4, but I'm guessing he's making a massive amount of this because 2 is going to be very garlicky. A large handful of parsley, a large handful of cilantro or coriander leaf, a small handful of rue. If you can find it, it's not something you're going to just be able to pick up at the store. I'm growing it in my garden, so I do have some fresh rue. You can get the dried kind online. I'll put a link to that in the description. Though, if you or anyone going to be having this is with child, do not eat the rue. It is.
The $7 Lux Cravings box has the Gordita Supreme?
Back off. You get no ad time here. Go away.
In fact, if you just don't want to have it at all or you can't find it, just use celery leaf. It's similar.
I think it's a different kind of rue there, Michael. Yeah, I don't think it's that kind of rue.
1 teaspoon of salt, 10 ounces or 280 grams of white cheese. I'm using fresh sheep's cheese. That's hard to say, fresh sheep's cheese. But you can use any kind that you want. He's not that specific, but it does need to be white because he is specific about that. Then 1 tablespoon of olive oil and 1 tablespoon of white wine vinegar. So first peel your garlic and chop it up, then chop your herbs. And then he says to crush the garlic in a mortar. But he must have had a huge mortar because just those 2 cloves half filled up my mortar. So I very quickly switched to a food processor, and I suggest you do the same. Then add the salt and the cheese. There is no way this amount of cheese would have ever fit in my mortar. Then add in the herbs and blend until, as he said, the white of the cheese and the green of the herbs have become one. E pluribus unum. Finally add the olive oil and the white wine vinegar and blend until smooth. Then set that aside as we make our bread. Now exactly what this bread is very hard to tell, but it does seem that there is a depiction of it without toppings in another fresco from Pompeii. And it looks as if there's maybe some sort of trench running around just inside the edge of the bread, possibly to keep the food from falling off like a pizza crust. Those breads were sometimes called mense, or singular mensa, and would be similar to the trenchers of the Middle Ages. They were just there to kind of hold your food like a plate. In fact, it means table. Mensa meant table. And these tables are referred to in another Virgil poem called the Aeneid. In it, the hero Aeneas is given a prophecy that he will establish a new city, but not before a deadly famine has come upon you, and the guilt of our blood drives you to gnaw round the edges of your tables, to put them between your teeth and eat them. Well, flash forward, and he and his men are now in Italy, and they're eating a rather meager meal of some fruit piled atop bread, and then they start eating the bread, and Aeneas realizes, look, we are eating even our tables. This is our home. So in a way, Italy was founded through the eating of pizza. Now, to make this version of ancient Roman pizza, what you'll need is 1 cup or 250 grams of active dough starter. Mine is from whole wheat, but you can use a regular batch of sourdough starter. Either will work. 2 cups or 475 milliliters of warm water. 4 cups or 500 grams of whole wheat flour. 3 tablespoons of olive oil. 1 tablespoon of salt. And 2 tablespoons of honey. Start by whisking the salt into the flour and then add your starter and the water. Combine these until somewhat incorporated and then add in the olive oil and the honey and work the dough for 2 to 3 minutes until everything is well combined. Note that you are not going to be kneading this dough like you would a traditional bread because you don't want it to puff up too big. It's still got to be a flatbread. Once it's become a nice cohesive dough, put a little bit more olive oil on the top and coat the dough. Then set a damp cloth on top and let it rise. And you want this to rise rather slowly. It's going to kind of depend on how active your starter is, but at least 4 hours up to overnight, like 10 or 12 hours, would actually be preferable. But it'll probably need to be in a cool place to do that. In the refrigerator overnight will work, but eventually it will double in size. And then don't punch it down, again, like you would a normal dough, but just gently take it out of the bowl and put it onto a lightly oiled surface. Now we're going to form this into a circle, and you can make one giant pizza, but according to the mosaic, it looks like it's like more of a personal pan pizza, so I divided my dough into fourths and then formed those into circles. And you can use your fingers to make that sort of trench around the edge of the circle, and then put a little bit of olive oil in there to keep that part from rising as much as the rest. Now you can bake these on a baking sheet, but if you want to more mimic that ancient Roman oven style, then you can put it on a hot pizza stone in your oven. Either way, you're going to heat the oven to 500 degrees Fahrenheit or 260 Celsius, and then take that round piece of dough and set it on the stone. Now I very quickly realized that my ability to move round dough from one place to another into the oven is lacking. So I quickly started putting some parchment underneath the dough, just better to transfer it. Then you can bake it for like 2 minutes, and then the parchment will just come right out, and you can finish baking it on the stone for another 8 minutes. And while it finishes in the oven, let us look at what else the archaeology of Pompeii can teach us about ancient Roman baking.
The giant grill gauge from combustion.
Nope, nope. You get no ad time here. Back off. Alright, here's the history
A
portion.
cloud from the mountain was ascending. My uncle was now so close to the mountain that the cinders, which grew thicker and hotter the nearer he approached, fell into the ships, together with pumice stones and black pieces of burning rock. The courtyard which led to his friend's apartment was so nearly filled with stones and ashes that if my uncle lingered any longer, it would have been impossible for him to have made his way out. That was Pliny the Younger describing the hours before his uncle, Pliny the Elder, died a victim of Mount Vesuvius. He had gone there to save some friends of his who were trapped and could only get out by sea, and being the commander of the fleet in the area, he had ships. Now Pliny the Elder did escape that villa as it filled up with ash and pumice, but he died soon after on the beaches from noxious gases coming down from the mountain. But little did he know that that ash that was burying his friend's villa along with the cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum, well, that ash would also preserve those places better than perhaps any from the ancient Roman world. Cold comfort to him, but a boon for us 2,000 years later who can learn so much about ancient Roman life from those sites. From the city's gladiators to its brothels to, of course, its food. And speaking of brothels and food, hic habitat felicitas. Here dwells happiness, sometimes translated as here dwells good fortune. And those words are inscribed along with, of all things, a phallus, and then hung above not a brothel, but a bakery. Because happiness indeed, bread is good fortune. Bakeries, or pistrina, are all over the archaeological sites at Pompeii and Herculaneum, about 35 having been found so far. One of the most famous is the bakery of Modestus, which, when excavated in 1862, included 81 loaves of abandoned bread, the baker having fled.
Wait. There were loaves of, like, petrified bread left over at Pompeii? That's amazing.
Fled the city with his baking still in progress. These loaves were the panis quadratus, perhaps the most famous bread of ancient Rome, which is depicted on several frescoes from Pompeii and is made of 8 sections formed by 4 lines, hence the quadratus. And I did an entire video on this bread way back when I first started the channel. I think it was just a few months in, so I'll put that, and you'll have to forgive the fact that I'm pretty sure I have no facial hair in that video. Now, another famous bakery is that of Popidius Priscus, and it's because his mill room, where he has his giant millstones, is so well preserved. He had 4 large millstones made of basalt lava, and these were usually turned by donkeys. There's actually an ancient Roman poem called The Golden Ass by Lucius Apuleius Africanus that describes
A poem called The Golden Ass. Okay. I feel like that would mean something different today.
this process. The poem is about a man who happens to get turned into a donkey, and then it's his first-person narrative of life as a human turned into a donkey. And at one point, he gets sold to a miller and walks into one of these rooms with the millstones. There, numerous beasts endlessly turned millstones of different sizes, not only by day, but all night long. The ceaseless turning of the wheels perpetually made flour. I was harnessed to the largest wheel, my head covered with a sack, and I was given a shove along the curving track. There are occasions where it was people doing this back-breaking work, though usually the stones would be quite a bit smaller, either slaves or the impoverished people who would just do anything for any kind of work. Even one of Rome's most famous playwrights, Plautus, was reduced to doing this work after he lost all of his money in a shipping accident. He would take a hand mill, a quern, and go door to door asking people if they had any grain to be milled. But regardless, once your grain was milled, you could make it into dough. And at the bakery of Popidius Priscus, this was done in the next room over, where he had massive mechanical paddles that would do the kneading. In fact, at his and other large bakeries, there was almost nothing done by hand except for the shaping of the loaves and putting the stamp on them. These were sometimes called signaculum, and were like putting a logo on your product, but less for advertising and more for quality control. Especially if it was bread that you were really proud of, you didn't want other people's inferior bread to be confused with your brand. So you would put your stamp on there and say, this is Max's bread. Now, giving out quality bread was very important, not only for your business, but it could even get you into public office. There are numerous pieces of graffiti in Pompeii that are endorsing people for public office. And one says, I beg you to elect Gaius Julius Polybius to the office of Aedile. He gives good bread. Other election graffiti.
Oh, that's hilarious. Oh my god. Yeah, vote this guy into office. He makes good bread. Can you imagine that? Like somebody runs like a pizza joint. They make such good pizza that someone's like, you should run for president. Vote John Johnson for president. He makes good pizza.
in the city includes endorsements like the chicken vendors request that you elect Epidius and Suetius as duovirs. And of course, the city's bakers and millers got in on the endorsements as well, because together they were very strong and influential groups, almost like trade unions of the day. And it really reminds me of that wonderful scene in the first season of the show Rome.
The Guild of Millers uses only the finest grains, true Roman bread for true Romans.
Just like this true Roman bread that should be ready to take out of the oven.
Minecraft trailer, take 2.
No ad time, go away.
Remove the bread and make sure it's got a nice color on the bottom, and then let it cool just for a moment before you spread your moretum on top. Remember to use just a little bit because it is very, very garlicky. My entire house smells like garlic right now. Then you can top it with things like white cheese, dates, pomegranate, or whatever else you thought you saw in the fresco. And here we are, the pizza of Pompeii. Now again, they probably would have just taken pieces off of here and just eaten them at first, you know, take a date or pomegranate or whatever and eaten it, and then finished the bread and dipped it with some cheese and everything. But I did a little slice just cuz, why not? Here we go. So garlicky. Like, to the point of spiciness when you have so much garlic, but it's actually delicious, but it is garlicky. I actually want to just try the bread because it does kind of overwhelm. I put too much garlic on there. Or not too much garlic, too much of the moretum. That bread is so flavorful. True Roman bread for true Romans indeed, or for true Maxes. But I also think that, like, if you have it with other things, I'm trying to, you can't see this, I'm trying to grab a, I've got some cheese on there, the moretum, and some pomegranate. That sweetness cuts through. That's the way to do it. Now, one thing that you'll notice is not on this is that ancient Roman condiment, garum. But I am finally making the long version of garum. It is currently in my backyard. It doesn't smell as bad as I would have thought. It's slowly digesting itself fish in salt. So that video will probably be out in the fall, I'm thinking, because it does need a couple more months in this hot sun. But yeah, and I recently made a t-shirt with "You Had Me at Garum," so I'll put that link in the description. And I'll see you next time on Tasting History, where I will have probably eaten all 4 of these and will be a few pounds heavier.
2,000-year-old Pompeii pizza. Sweet potato coffee, what? No ad time, go away.
Bullets, nothing was more important to a Civil War soldier than coffee. Now, the North and South loved the stuff, but the Confederates definitely had a harder time getting their hands on it, so they came up with alternatives like this rye and sweet potato coffee, which was sent to General George Pickett from his wife. So thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video as we make Civil War coffee, or at least what passed as coffee, this time on Tasting History. This week is the 160th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, and as a Civil War buff myself, I wanted to make a video that had some connection to that battle. Well, as it happens, one of the most famous characters, one of the most famous figures involved in that battle, General George Pickett, famous for his failed charge, which bears his name and marks the turning point in the war, well, he once received a care package from his wife, and it included the South's version of coffee. Come to think of it, my prentice, you must have been up all night to have made up and sent out such a basket of goodies, and baked and buttered such a lot of biscuits, and made so many jugs of coffee as came this morning. My, I tell you, it all tasted good, and the coffee, well, no mocha or Java ever tasted half so good as this rye sweet potato blend. Bless your thoughtful heart. You know, as odious of a man as he was, and he was, he does write a pretty sweet letter. Anyway, I didn't actually think that I would find a recipe for this sweet potato and rye coffee, and technically I didn't, but it turns out the newspapers, especially early on in the war in the South, were filled with recipes for coffee alternatives, and I did find a recipe for sweet potato coffee and a recipe for rye coffee. The sweet potato coffee recipe comes from the Albany Patriot in Georgia. Preparation: peel your potatoes and slice them rather thin. Dry them in the air or on the stove, then cut into pieces small enough to go into the coffee mill, then grind it. 2 tablespoonsful of ground coffee and 3 or 4 of ground potatoes will make 8 or 9 cups of coffee, clear, pure, and well tasted. So what's interesting is this recipe calls for mixing the sweet potato coffee with real coffee, and that was possible at the very beginning of the war, which is when this recipe was written. But as time progresses, most of the recipes drop off the coffee, and we'll talk about exactly why that was a little bit later. But for this sweet potato coffee, all you need is 4 or 5 sweet potatoes. But exactly what sweet potato they're talking about is not very clear, because then, just as now, the term sweet potato, especially in the South, was often used interchangeably with yam, and there are different types of sweet potato. So I think either one is going to work. I would steer clear from maybe purple sweet potatoes, but since you are looking for a coffee color, I wouldn't go with the white sweet potato, but something at least a little orange so it gives it some color. So wash and peel them, then slice them very thin and set them on some trays to dry. Now you can do this out in the sun, and I imagine it would kind of take all day. And I say I imagine because I tried it, but I had to abandon my endeavor because the squirrels just wouldn't leave them alone. So I ended up putting them into the oven for about 3 hours on the very lowest setting until they became like sweet potato hardtack. Once they're nice and dry and have shriveled up really tiny, then break them up and then put them into a coffee grinder and grind until you have a powder. Now, according to the author of this recipe, the above is worthy of a trial. We have thoroughly tested its qualities and can perceive no difference in taste from the genuine coffee. We regard it as every way equal to Rio, Java, or the Mocha coffee. I'm skeptical, but I guess we'll find out. But first, we need to make our rye component, and for that, the recipe comes from the Charleston, South Carolina Mercury. Take rye, boil it, but not so much as to burst the grain. Then dry it either in the sun or on the stove or in a kiln, after which it is ready for parching to be used like the real coffee bean. Prepared in this manner, it can hardly be distinguished from the genuine coffee. Again, skeptical, especially because this one does not call for any actual coffee included. It's just dried rye ground up. And so for this, what you need is a cup or so of rye added to a pot of boiling water. Then reduce it to a simmer and let it simmer for about 12 minutes. Then strain them and let them dry. And just like the sweet potatoes, you can leave them out in the sun because squirrels don't like rye. Oh, it turns out, yes they do. They'll absolutely eat anything or at least mess it around the yard. So leave it on the stove or put it in the oven.
With wind training,
Back off. You got no ad time here.
They too are ready to grind. Now, neither of these look anything like real coffee grounds, and they don't smell anything like real coffee grounds, but maybe they'll taste like real coffee grounds. But before we try that out, let me tell you a bit about coffee during the Civil War and why both North and South loved a cup, whether it was real or not. So like I said, the coffee situation during the Civil War really depended greatly on which side of the battlefield you were on, so I'm going to break this up into Union coffee and Confederate coffee. For those boys in blue, coffee was a big part of their ration. For every 100 men, they received 10 pounds of green coffee or 8 pounds of roasted and ground coffee. Green coffee being unroasted coffee, and it had a longer shelf life, so they did prefer to hand that out, but it meant that the men had to roast their own coffee, which they would often do either in a skillet or in a pot just over the fire. But a few people did have access to coffee roasters thanks to Wilder Dwight of the 2nd Massachusetts Infantry. Just a few months after the war started, he wrote to his parents, "I wish you to buy and forward by express a large coffee roaster which will roast 30 or 40 pounds at a time. There is a kind, I am told. It would be of immense advantage to us." And only 2 weeks later, he wrote, "Coffee roaster has arrived and is merrily at work." This is a comfort. Tell father he is the regiment's friend, and I bless him. Once roasted, then they had to grind their own coffee beans, either with a pan or hitting.
Like, this guy seriously asked his, like, family to send him, a large-scale coffee roaster. Then he was like, "'Tis a blessing, thank you all."
With a bayonet, though some have said that they would hit them with the butt of their rifle, which seems like a terrible way to treat a rather important tool on the battlefield. But there was actually a gun called the Sharps carbine, which in some models was fitted with a hand-cranked grinder in the stock and was often referred to as a coffee grinder. Now, it probably wasn't actually meant for coffee. Nobody seems to know what it was really meant for, but after practical tests in recent years, they've determined it's likely that it was used to grind charcoal for gunpowder, which would make sense to have that in the butt of your carbine, your gun. But maybe some people did use it as a coffee grinder. It was called a coffee grinder often, but probably just because it looked like a coffee grinder. But maybe people were mashing them with the butt of their gun and thought, hey, we should just put a grinder in the coffee or in the gun. I don't know. But whatever they did, once they had their grounds, it was time to make your coffee. Now, a lot of 19th century recipes for coffee have you boil the water with the coffee grounds in it. But the coffee should not be put in the water before it boils. At first I was green enough to do so, but soon learned better, being compelled to march before the water boiled, and consequently lost my coffee. I lost both the water and the coffee. All that work to roast and grind it, and he lost his coffee. And there was nothing worse than losing your coffee. Coffee was their staff of life, and they must have it, no matter what risk attended. The most disheartening event that could happen a soldier was to be called into line just as his coffee pot was beginning to bubble. That was Fenwick Headley of the 32nd Illinois Infantry, and he says that the men needed their coffee no matter what risk attended, i.e., people would risk their lives to get coffee. And perhaps
Oh, that's crazy, yo. Imagine that. It's like, hey, can you hold the battle for a second? I need to have my coffee.
the most famous person to do this was a 19-year-old commissary sergeant named William McKinley, future president of the United States.
I thought that name
On
sounded
September
familiar.
17th, 1862, his Ohio regiment was at the Battle of Antietam, the bloodiest single day in American history. Early in the afternoon, naturally enough, with the exertion required of the men, they were famished and thirsty, and to some extent broken in spirit. The commissary department of that brigade was under Sergeant McKinley's administration and personal supervision. From his hands, every man in the regiment was served with hot coffee and warm meats. He passed under fire and delivered with his own hands these things so essential for the men for whom he was laboring. What I find fascinating is that quote was from an officer in that same regiment named Rutherford B. Hayes, another future president of the United States. 2 future presidents in 1 regiment. Kind of crazy. Later in McKinley's political career, he used the event as kind of part of his origin story, and at the battlefield today, there is a monument that commemorates history's most dangerous coffee run. Now, the reason that someone would risk their life to get coffee to the troops was because the caffeine in that coffee was essential to many. They would often call it their nerve tonic. And there were some soldiers or even generals who really believed in the virtues of this nerve tonic, of the caffeine. Most famously was General Benjamin Butler. He would have his men pour the water out of their canteens and fill them instead with coffee. And it's said that he would even plan attacks around the time of day when his troops were most caffeinated. He told one general that if your men get their coffee early in the morning, you can hold. That said, Butler is often considered one of the worst generals the Union had, so maybe his advice should be taken with a grain of salt. But it wasn't just him who loved an excess of coffee, as what we each man drank at every meal would keep a New England family a day. And Alexander Downing of the 11th Iowa Infantry wrote, "One man in our company, Long John as the boys have nicknamed him, is a great coffee drinker. He carries a 2-quart peach can strapped to his haversack, and every day buys up 1 or 2 rations of coffee from the boys who do not use much." Though poor coffee-loving Long John would have been frustrated as the war went on, because Even the Union began to have trouble getting good coffee. In 1863, an Ohio soldier wrote, "There is a good deal of complaint in our company, at least, about the coffee we get. It seems not quite so good as that we have had, and I suspect it has been adulterated by someone who is willing to get rich at the expense of the poor soldier." And by the end of the war, Ebenezer Gilpin lamented, "We are reduced to about quarter rations and no coffee. And nobody can soldier without coffee." But he wrote that in April of 1863, after General Lee had already surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, while General Lee's men, the rebel soldiers, well, they'd been going without coffee since pretty much day one. The Anaconda Plan was General Winfield Scott's idea to completely blockade the South from getting any supplies from outside the Confederacy, and this meant no coffee was coming in from Brazil or the other coffee-growing regions. And just a few months after Fort Sumter was fired upon, Southern newspapers start including recipes for fake coffee.
You're not a couch potato. You're a couch.
Oh, never mind.
They were just a way to supplement your coffee, to make what coffee you had last a little bit longer. But very, very quickly, like within the first year, coffee is pretty much gone, and it's just recipes for something warm to drink that might look and taste like coffee. These coffee alternatives became known as Lincoln coffee and were made of, among other things, acorns, rice, okra, peanuts, asparagus, persimmons, field peas, beets, rye, sweet potato, and even cotton seeds. In New Orleans, they would use chicory, which proved so popular that years later, when coffee became available again, they continued to use the chicory as well. You can still get it with your beignets at Café du Monde, which set up shop in 1862 during the Civil War. Though I do believe it is now blended with caffeinated coffee. Though caffeinated or non-caffeinated just chicory coffee still sounds preferable to what Luther Hopkins of the 6th Virginia Infantry described. During the winter months, when we needed some kind of beverage to wash down our hardtack, the only thing we could get was horse feed, which was roasted and boiled. We called it coffee. We had to rob our horses for this, and we all felt mean when we did it. And if a Confederate soldier was able to get their hands on real coffee, it was usually done by trading with Union soldiers. Our boys and the Johnnies on the skirmish line entered into an agreement not to fire on one another. Boys would meet between the lines, exchange tobacco for coffee. The Rebs were always very anxious to get hold of New York papers. But if you weren't able to get it in a swap, then you'd better be saving your pennies if you wanted to have some real coffee. Because at the beginning of the war, in March of 1861, 1 pound of coffee was sold for $1.20 in the Confederacy. But by the end of the war, it was up to $196 a pound. And now the Confederate dollar was way devalued, but even so, that was really, really expensive for some coffee. That is why most were dependent on these faux coffees. But if the recipes were to be believed, you couldn't tell the difference between the fake coffee and a real cup of coffee. Like one recipe for war coffee. It called for mixing equal parts coffee and equal parts cornmeal, and swore that I have used it for 2 weeks, and several friends visiting my house say they could not discover anything peculiar in the taste of my coffee, but pronounced it very good. Try it and see if we can't get along comfortably even while our ports are blockaded by the would-be king. And there were tons of these recipes, and they all read very similarly, always ending with, "And you'll never believe it's not coffee." Kind of reminds me of those "I can't believe it's not butter" ads from the 90s.
I can't believe it's not butter.
But just like Family Guy mocked those ads,
I can't believe.
so too did the newspapers of the South mock the recipes for the faux coffee. Like this one from the Arkansas True Democrat. Recipes for the times. To make coffee. Take tan bark, 3 parts, 3 old cigar stumps, and a quart of water. Mix well and boil 15 minutes in a dirty coffee pot. And the best judges cannot tell it from the finest mocha. And they mocked it because as much as people tried to convince themselves that this stuff tasted like real coffee, it didn't, and they knew it. After every experiment to make coffee of what was not coffee, we were driven to decide that there was nothing coffee but coffee. And when a British officer, Sir Arthur Lyon Fremantle, visited the Confederate States in 1863, he remarked, "The loss of coffee afflicts the Confederates even more than the loss of spirits, and they exercise their ingenuity in devising substitutes which are not generally very successful." Nobody was fooled, which is why I'm really curious what this rye and sweet potato coffee is going to taste like. So to start off, bring a quart of water to a boil. You can use a coffee pot or just a regular pot, or if you have a mucket, use that. Muckets were what many of the soldiers would have boiled their coffee in, and basically it's just a tin canister. Once it's boiling, add a heaping quarter cup of the coffee mixture. I am using half the sweet potato and half the rye, but you could use like a third sweet potato, a third rye, and a third regular coffee if it's the beginning of the war and you still had access to coffee. What you don't want to do is add it while it's boiling. You want to turn off the heat and then add it, because if you add it while it's boiling, it does this. So take it off the heat, add the grounds, and let it steep for 7 or 8 minutes or until all of the grounds have fallen to the bottom of the pot. Then you can pour yourself a cup of General Pickett's rye and sweet potato coffee. So I have the tin cup here, but I also poured it into a glass so you can see a little better what this actually looks like. And it ain't coffee. Now, one of the early recipes would have you add coffee as well, so it probably would look a lot more like coffee, but this looks more like tea or apple cider. The thing is, it smells really good. It smells like sweet potatoes. Let's give it a go. It's very, very hot. That's very, very hot, but tastes like sweet potatoes. It is sweet potato tea. I'm not sure that the rye necessarily, no, it does.
Oh, love what you find.
Nope. Go away, go away, go away, go away.
Do it. But coffee? No. But good, yes. Also, I have some hardtack here, a little broken piece of hardtack that I just want to dip in it, because that's often how they would have eaten their hardtack, was just dipping it into coffee to soften it up. Doesn't really work in this cup, but I'll have a tiny, tiny piece that hopefully I won't break my teeth on. I don't know how long it needs to soak. Probably longer than that. Yeah, longer than that. Well, I got a little bit off. This is 2 years old at this point. And still as tasteless as the day it was baked. And it is still really, really hard. What is not hard is building a website from today's sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace makes building a website so easy, especially with their
So yeah, I guess that coffee wasn't actually coffee. 'Tis fool's coffee. History of PB&J. World War II carrot cake. Coronation chicken. Queen Elizabeth's coronation chicken. Rip Queen Liz. She will always be my queen, even though I'm American. Oh yeah, the bread in a can, I remember now. Milk soup? Ancient Sumerian beer. Illegal coffee. Ah, good old haggis. History of mac and cheese, let's go. Nope, nope, you get no ad time. Be gone. I cast thee out.
Whether it comes out of a blue box or is served with Gruyere and lobster, mac and cheese can do no wrong. And so I have high hopes for this 19th century mac and cheese recipe with the fancy name, macaroni à la reine. So thank you to Bright Cellars for sponsoring this video as we celebrate gastronomy's power couple, macaroni and cheese, this time on Tasting History. So if you look at early macaroni and cheese recipes, they tend to be very simple. Pasta, cheese, and butter. The channel Townsends did an excellent video on making one of these early 18th century recipes for mac and cheese, so I'll put a link to that in the description. But since John had already done the 18th century, I decided to move a little bit later to the 19th century when macaroni and cheese started to flex its muscles. And I found this recipe from 1845 for what I assume Eliza Acton thinks is macaroni and cheese fit for a queen, because she calls it macaroni à la reine. This is a very excellent and delicate mode of dressing macaroni. Boil 8 ounces in the usual way, and by the time it is sufficiently tender, dissolve gently 10 ounces of any rich, well-flavored white cheese in fully 3/4 of a pint of good cream. Add a little salt, a rather full seasoning of cayenne, from half to a whole saltspoon of pounded mace, and a couple of ounces of sweet fresh butter. The cheese should, in the first instance, be sliced very thin. It should be stirred in the cream without intermission until it is entirely dissolved and the whole is perfectly smooth. The cheese may be poured equally over the macaroni, thickly covered before it is sent to table, with fine crumbs of bread fried of a pale gold color. Nothing too complicated in the process, and so it really comes down to what ingredients you're using. So let's start with the macaroni. Now you can make your own at home, but you might run into the same problem that Thomas Jefferson did. See, he actually wrote down a recipe for making macaroni along with a diagram of a pasta machine. And then he had one of those machines
Thomas
sent from
Jefferson?
Italy to America so he could have fresh pasta made for him. But he quickly realized that the pasta was inferior to that he had had in Italy and in France, and it all came down to the flour. He noted that the best macaroni in Italy is made with a particular sort of flour called semola in Naples. So he ended up still importing pasta from Italy, which is actually how most people got their pasta for a very long time. And so, to be appropriate to the period, you're going to want a half pound or 225 grams of dried macaroni. The shape of which is really up to you, because at the time, macaroni could refer to pretty much any type of pasta. Eliza Acton even says that there is ribbon macaroni or lasagna, though the tube shape was becoming the standard when talking about macaroni. The one thing it would not have been is the elbow-shaped macaroni that we know today, because that wasn't made until a bit later. Now, one thing to keep in mind when you are choosing your pasta is that it's of a yellowish tint, by no means white, as one sees them when they are of inferior quality. So to prepare the pasta, she says to add a little salt and a bit of butter the size of a walnut to the boiling water before adding in the pasta. Now, she and other cookbooks from the time say to boil the macaroni at a full rolling boil for 3/4 of an hour. And that's after it's often soaked for an hour or more in milk or water. So I'm going to guess that they very much liked the pasta to be much softer than we often have it today, and the pasta was probably much thicker, so it did take longer to boil. Not entirely sure, but if you are going to boil it for a full 3/4 of an hour, that'll give you plenty of time to pop open a bottle of wine from today's sponsor, Bright Cellars. And I gotta say, wine does go very well with mac and like Cabernet. That's okay, because with Bright Cellars you take are 2 reasons to drink wine. And while you nurse that glass of insert favorite wine here, you can start your cheese sauce. And for that, what you'll need is 10 ounces or 285 grams of white cheese thinly sliced. Now, many old recipes call for Parmesan, but if Parmesan be used for it, it must be grated. But as we have said before, it will not easily blend with the other ingredients so as to be smooth. Use whatever you want. I'm using white cheddar. 1 3/4 cup or 425 milliliters of cream, 4 tablespoons or 55 grams of unsalted butter, a half teaspoon of salt, a 1/4 teaspoon of cayenne, and a 1/4 teaspoon of mace. You'll also need some dried breadcrumbs. So first add the cream to a small saucepan and bring to a simmer. Then add the cheese and stir it in until fully melted, and then add the salt, the cayenne, mace, and the butter, and stir everything in. And you can add more or less cayenne and mace to your taste. At the same time, put the breadcrumbs in a dry pan and set them over low heat, keeping them moving so they don't burn. And you'll notice it can take a little while to get those breadcrumbs to that nice golden brown that you want, and yet it takes almost no time to go from golden brown to burnt. Now, with the breadcrumbs, pasta, and cheese sauce all going at the same time, you might not think that this is a good time for a lecture on the history of macaroni and cheese, but here it is anyway.
God damn it. Snuck up on me.
Pasta with cheese goes back at least to ancient Rome. Cato the Elder's placenta, which I've made here on the channel, is essentially cheese between layers of a proto-pasta called tracta. By the Middle Ages, a dish with many of the same components begins to appear, lasagnes. The 14th century recipes usually call for pasta to be layered with cheese and then sweet spices like cinnamon and sugar. And the English form of curry from around 1390 has a recipe that just calls for pasta, butter, and cheese, and they call it macarons. In the mid-14th century, in the Decameron, Giovanni Boccaccio wrote of the town of Bengodi, a sadly fictional place where on a mountain all of grated Parmesan cheese dwell folk that do naught else but make macaroni and ravioli and boil them in capon's broth. And he says they would roll the pasta down the Parmesan mountain where people would scramble to get their hands on this mythical medieval mac and cheese. Now, regional differences between macaroni also begin to appear. Naples, Genoa, Rome, they all had variations in the flour quantity, the shape of the pasta, and in their preparation. In 1465, Maestro Martino's recipe for macaroni romaneschi calls for it to be plated with good cheese, butter, and sweet spices. Similar flavors to the earlier recipe from England. And the macaroni connection between Italy and England is rather complex. It appeared in the form of curry in 1390, and then the first recipe called macaroni and cheese, or rather to dress macaroni with Parmesan cheese, appeared in Elizabeth Raffles' 1769 The Experienced English.
Perhaps there's some sort of reasoning for that, but why is there an F? Why is there an F in the S position? That's something I see in, like, older English, but why?
English housekeeper. But around that same time, there's a linguistic curveball thrown because in England, the term macaroni not only referred to pasta, but also to a type of fashion. Yankee Doodle went to town a-riding on a pony. He stuck a feather in his hat and called it macaroni. Every American knows that song, and by the end of the American Revolution, it had become a patriotic ditty, but it actually started off as a bit of an insult to the colonists. Some claim that it was a way to mock the colonists by saying that they were so uncouth that merely by putting a feather in their cap they thought that they were fashionable. But I'm pretty sure it was actually a way to attack their masculinity. See, in the mid-18th century, it had become popular for the wealthy young men of England to take their grand tour, which was a lengthy trip around the European continent with a focus on the splendors of the Italian peninsula. While there, they would develop a taste for the finer things in life, elegant fashion, sophisticated manners, and an appreciation for top cuisine like the Italian macaroni. And similar to the Finer Things Club from The Office, these young sophisticates became members of what was called the Macaroni Club. And when they returned to England, they wore their ostentatious outfits and their bejeweled wigs. And had there been a RuPaul's Macaroni race 250 years ago, they might have become cultural icons. But that is not how it turned out. See, the style of dress coincided with a time where it was very popular to mock the wealthier classes, and the fashion just made it too easy. In 1770, the Oxford Magazine declared, "There is indeed a kind of animal, neither male nor female, a thing of the neuter gender, lately started up among us. It is called macaroni. It talks without meaning, it smiles without pleasantry, it eats without appetite, it rides without exercise, it wenches without passion." They were ahead of their time, and the style was short-lived, and the term macaroni returned to meaning pasta. But again, any pasta. Especially in Italy, any shape of pasta was still called macaroni. In fact, if you look at the many paintings and later photographs titled macaroni eaters, they are almost always Neapolitans eating long strands of pasta with their hands. More like fettuccine or spaghetti today. And that may be what Thomas Jefferson saw when he visited Italy in 1787, though he had surely come in contact with macaroni being eaten with a fork when he was in Paris. When he moved to France in 1784, he brought along his enslaved chef, James Hemings. And as Jefferson did his diplomat thing, Hemings was learning the art of French cooking. He studied under several of France's greatest chefs at the time and is often considered to be the first American chef trained in France. And when they returned to America, Hemmings brought many of the recipes he learned with him, some of which Jefferson wrote down, like the macaroni. And I intend to do an entire episode on James Hemmings, but for the purpose of this episode, it's important to know that it was likely his macaroni recipe that helped make macaroni popular in the United States, because Thomas Jefferson pushed the dish on everyone. Shortly after he became president, Jefferson served a macaroni pie at a state dinner in 1802.
A macaroni pie at an official state dinner. Okay. Can you imagine that? Like, fucking Trump serving a macaroni pie.
Hemmings had passed away by then, but it was likely his recipe or a version of it that was used. And it's unclear if it had any cheese in it, and it wasn't actually a universal hit at first. One guest of the dinner, a member of the House of Representatives, Reverend Manasseh Cutler, said, "February 6th, Saturday. Dined at the President's. Dinner not as elegant as when we dined before." Among other dishes, a pie called macaroni, which appeared to be a rich crust filled with the strillions of onions or shallots, which I took it to be, tasted very strong and not agreeable. Another guest was Meriwether Lewis of Lewis and Clark, and when Cutler asked about the onions in the dish, Mr. Lewis told me there were none in it. It was an Italian dish, and what appeared like onions was made of flour and butter with a particularly strong liquor mixed with them. So he doesn't mention cheese in the dish, but after dinner he says, "We drank tea and viewed again the great cheese." And at first I thought maybe he was talking about the macaroni dish, but no. Rather, it is a wheel of cheese that was given to Jefferson as a gift, and Jefferson kept it in its own dedicated room, and people would travel for days just to have Jefferson invite them to the Mammoth Room and see the mammoth cheese. And if you think politics is divisive now, back then even the cheese was partisan, as the man who made it said that when it came to the milk used to produce the cheese, no federal cow must contribute a drop. And that might explain why Cutler was such a grump at the dinner, because he, like the unrepresented cows,
The $7 Lux Cravings
come
box
on.
has the Gordita Supreme.
What the hell? There's so many ads in this one video.
not been wooed by the macaroni. Most of the population was, because it starts appearing in many of the early cookbooks from America, including The Virginia Housewife or Methodical Cook in 1824. It was written by Mary Randolph, and it does have cheese. And the fact that Mary Randolph was a close cousin to Thomas Jefferson and spent time with the family makes me wonder if her recipe is not in some way influenced by a version that James Hemmings served 50 years earlier. Now, macaroni at this point was still mostly being imported from Italy, so it wasn't inexpensive. And so the dish, rather than calling it simply macaroni and cheese, would often be given more elaborate names, like macaroni à la sauce blanche or macaroni à la reine, like the one that we're making today. And even as the price of pasta started to come down, it was still generally known as a rather luxurious dish among the wealthy. But there was a concern.
Imagine that. Imagine that. Like, every kid growing up nowadays eats macaroni and cheese, but could you imagine that? Like, macaroni and cheese being a rich person's dish.
Concerted effort to change this. In 1855, Alexis Soyer.
Oh, alright, I see the hydrate. I see the hydrate.
One of Victorian England's most celebrated chefs, wrote of vermicelli and macaroni. Pray, Eloise, why should not the workman and mechanic partake of these wholesome and nutritious articles of food, which have now become so plentiful and cheap? Macaroni is now selling in London at 5 pence per pound, and makes 4 pounds of food when boiled. And it took a while.
Now you know why Farina likes mac and cheese. She never states specifically mac and cheese. She states that she, like, just stocks up on a whole lot of macaroni. She never states specifically mac and cheese. Although I feel like it can be implied.
But eventually it did become accessible to the masses. But once everyone was eating it, it kind of lost its appeal amongst the wealthy, and so the fancy French-named macaroni and cheeses fell off of the menus of nicer restaurants, especially those in the northern United States. But in the southern United States, it remained rather popular, especially amongst the African American population. This is also where we start to see that divide between Southern soul food style of macaroni and cheese, which is made with real cheese, and the boxed version that's made with processed cheese. And for the evolution of that processed macaroni and cheese, we actually have to go to Switzerland, because both the macaroni and the cheese started there. It was in Lucerne in 1872 that elbow-shaped macaroni was first produced. And completely unrelated, in 1911, it was two Swiss food chemists who were looking for a way to extend the shelf life of Emmentaler cheese that came up with the first processed cheese. Basically, cheese takes a while to mature, but then once it is, it goes bad really, really quickly and can become poisonous if you eat it. And so they would melt it down to kill all of the bacteria and mold, and then add sodium citrate. That would keep the melted cheese from separating, and then it could be resolidified into a block of processed cheese. But did the Swiss put their elbow macaroni and processed cheese together? No, it took a Canadian to do that. James Lewis Kraft was born in 1874 and grew up on his family's dairy farm in Stevensville, Ontario. In 1903, he went into
The Kraft behind Kraft mac and cheese.
the wholesale business when he moved to Chicago and started selling cheese to grocers off of the back of a rented horse-drawn wagon. The issue was with cheese's short shelf life, he had trouble selling in bulk, and during the summer without refrigeration, he had trouble selling it at all. So doing a little research, he came across the same process that the Swiss had and melted it down and then added sodium phosphate, which seemed to work better for his cheddar. He canned the cheese and sold it in bulk all year round. And in 1916, he patented the process just before America went into World War I. That's when he sold 6 million pounds of Kraft cheese to the American government to be sent unspoiled to the front lines in France.
God damn, 6 million pounds. I imagine he made quite the pretty penny off of that deal.
The cheese business boomed. He expanded and bought Velveeta in 1927, but still, the marriage between macaroni and processed cheese had yet to be realized. But then the Great Depression hit. The story goes that during the Depression, Grant Leslie, a Scottish salesman working in St. Louis, Missouri, was selling his pasta, and to make it more enticing, would put a rubber band around it with a packet of Kraft cheese. Well, Kraft saw this, loved the idea, and decided we could do that. And in 1937, they introduced Kraft Dinner, a meal for four in 9 minutes for an everyday price of 19 cents. One box could feed a family of 4, or a max of 1. 8 million boxes of Kraft Dinner were sold that first year, and by 1943, 80 million boxes were sold, because during World War II, protein from meat and dairy were hard to come by. And that box of mac and cheese packed a lot of protein for just 1 ration coupon. It was also a quick meal for a time when women were working in factories and not at home cooking the complicated meals of years past.
Oh, god damn it. Back off. Go away. You got no ad time here. Go away.
Ended that quick meal was awful enticing, as one of the radio ads said, "Don't hurry, puff and wheeze. There's a main dish that's a breeze." Kraft Dinner first came in a yellow box, and in 1954 they switched over to the blue box. And as popular as Kraft macaroni and cheese is here in the United States, it's actually much more popular under its original name, Kraft Dinner, or now KD, up in Canada, where it's often called the unofficial meal of Canada. One thing I find interesting is that today we just take the packet of cheese and mix it with some milk and then the pasta and you're good to go. But in 1938, when it first came out, they actually had recipes to kind of spruce it up. And one of the first recipes had a pinch of cayenne pepper, just like the Victorian recipe that I'm about to eat. So once all of the components of the mac and cheese are ready, put the drained pasta into a dish or a pan and pour the cheese sauce over it, making sure everything is well coated. Then sprinkle on the toasted breadcrumbs and serve. And here we are, macaroni à la reine, fancy Victorian mac and cheese. Here we go. All right, straight off, my favorite part, the breadcrumbs. I could put like a whole loaf of breadcrumbs on here. They just add such a wonderful texture. The rest of the texture is like macaroni and cheese. I mean, very, smooth and creamy with the texture of macaroni. The flavor is really going to depend on what cheese you use, because I'm not getting a lot of... I take that back. I am getting some of the mace and and that cayenne, especially at the very, very end. It takes a second. At first, it's like all I'm tasting is the cheese. And it's wonderful, but like I said, whatever cheese you use, that's the main flavor. But then you get that mace and that cayenne. What's interesting is it actually reminds me of the rice soup in the Third Class Titanic video. And thinking back on that, the main ingredients, the flavors there were mace and cayenne. And it's kind of from around the same period. It's about 50 years later, I guess. But that's really interesting. Basically, instead of cheese and macaroni, it's rice and milk with those spices. So you should give this one a shot, or any of the other old macaroni and cheese dishes, and definitely put breadcrumbs. I'm gonna start doing that just on like Kraft macaroni and cheese, because that's really, really fantastic. So make a bowl of mac and cheese, and I will see you next time on Tasting History.
Remember to like and subscribe. Oh, decisions. Decisions. Ninja diet? Fish pudding. Oh yeah, history of donuts. That was good. Oh, there's so much. I don't know what to pick. There's so much good stuff here. Gladiator Gatorade. Wait, what? The London beer flood. Okay, you have my attention. God damn it, feck off.
And you're getting ready to host a Victorian-style soiree for all of your closest friends, and it turns out all you have is beer, sugar, and eggs. What do? Well, you make beer punch, of course, and that's what we're making today. We'll also talk about the infamous and quite literal London beer flood of 1814, this time on Drinking History. So there aren't that many beer cocktails around today. There are a few, but not that many, and frankly, I think that's probably for the best. But in his 1896 book, Fancy Drinks and Popular Beverages by The Only William gives us a recipe for beer punch. Boil 1 quart of beer with 1/4 of a pound of lump sugar and a stick of cinnamon. Beat 4 eggs into foam and mix it with a wineglass of Old Jamaica rum. Take the beer from the fire and add it to the mixture while continually stirring it. Serve in punch glasses. Sounds kind of weird, but one of the very first episodes of Tasting History was a buttered beer from the 16th century which had butter and eggs in it, so maybe this is like a descendant. Anyway, for this recipe, what you'll need is 1 quart or 1 liter of beer. Now the beer is really up to you. He's very specific in other recipes what beer to use. He's not in this one, so I figure pretty much anything is going to be fine. I'd probably use something like a darker ale, or I'm using a dark porter because that ties into our history today. A heaping half cup, or about 115 grams of sugar. Now I'm using an unrefined raw sugar. You can also use regular sugar. It calls for lump sugar, which is less sweet than a regular granulated sugar, so I think that this is probably the way to go. 1 cinnamon stick, 4 eggs, I've already cracked mine, and 2 ounces of rum. Now he calls for an old Jamaica rum, which was a darker rum like this. This one is actually from Hawaii, but it'll work for this. I wouldn't use, well, no flavored rums, and probably not a white rum for this either. So first, go ahead and pour your beer into a pot or a saucepan. Then we're going to mix in the sugar using an adorable little Pikachu spatula. And we'll also kind of mix it in. It's probably not going to dissolve very well at the beginning, but once it gets heated up, it will. Throw in your cinnamon stick. Should add some good flavor. And then start heating it. We're going to bring it up to a simmer. Calls for a boil, but let's go a light boil, like a simmer. While that heats up, go ahead and whisk your eggs. You want to get them nice and foamy. They're not going to get too big, like if they were just egg whites, but they should get nice and foamy. It's just going to take you a while. It'll take a few minutes for them to get foamy, but the beer is going to take even longer to start to simmer. So while I wait for that, let me tell you about this really crazy day in 1814. Our story begins, as so many do, in foggy old London town, on the corner of Tottenham Court Road and Oxford Street in an area then known as St. Giles Rookery. And frankly, it was not a very nice place. And it hadn't been since the 12th century when Queen Matilda opened St. Giles Hospital there, and it was used as a leper colony for centuries. By the 15th century, they had added gallows for executions, which oddly enough did not help real estate prices, and then in 1606, as if they needed to make it official, Parliament condemned the area as deep, foul, and dangerous. And in 1665, the Great Plague of London broke out in that neighborhood. Really, they just couldn't catch a break. Though there were times when it was a bit of a destination spot, seeing as it was on the route from Newgate Prison to the gallows at Tyburn, and the condemned were often allowed to pop in one last time to an inn called the Angel. The clergy at the church next door would pay for them to have one last drink called a St. Giles Bowl. This was a neighborhood whose inhabitants were described by the writer Henry Mayhew as a noisy and riotous lot, fond of street brawls, and fat, ragged, and saucy, which coincidentally is the name of my exotic dance trio. Let's welcome to the stage, Fat, Ragged, and Saucy. So naturally, this was the neighborhood that Henry Mew decided to invest in 1809 when he bought the Horseshoe Brewery. And based on the neighborhood's track record, he could not have been that surprised at what happened just a few years later. See, Mew had built a 22-foot-high wooden vat capable of holding 18,000 barrels of porter, and it was held together by several massive 700-pound iron bands. Well, around 4:30 in the afternoon on October 17, 1814, the storehouse clerk, George Crick, saw that one of the bands was slipping. And when he went to his supervisor to tell him about it, the supervisor just said, yeah, that happens sometimes. Go write a letter to one of the partners. They'll handle it when they have the time and money. Unfortunately, an hour later, standing only 30 feet away from the vat, probably with that little letter in his hand, the vat burst. A torrent of porter ripped through the facility, knocking over other vats, releasing an estimated 320,000 gallons of beer. The wave of which knocked down the 25-foot wall at the back of the brewery, sending a 15-foot wave of beer into the streets of London. And the first casualty was when that wall fell on 14-year-old Eleanor Cooper as she was washing pots outside of the Tavistock Arms, where she worked. The wave moved on to destroy several houses, in one of which Hannah Banfield, a 4-year-old, and her mother were having tea and swept Hannah into the street, killing her almost instantly. In another house, people were holding an Irish wake for a 2-year-old boy who had just passed away, and the beer came in and killed all of the mourners. As there were no drains in the street, the cellars in the buildings surrounding the street filled up with porter, nearly drowning some and injuring many others, and in total, 8 people died.
Introducing the all-new Buick Enclave.
Back off, I swear to God.
The Morning Post said that it was a scene of desolation that presents a most awful and terrific appearance, equal to that which fire or earthquake may be supposed to occasion. Now, the press at the time made no mention of drunken riots or people going out into the streets filling up their cups with beer. But due to an anti-Irish sentiment in the city at the time, and this was a very Irish neighborhood, those stories began to crop up in the following weeks. But there's no reason to think that it actually happened because the fact that it didn't appear in any of the papers, which weren't terribly pro-Irish either. What also didn't happen was any kind of accountability for the brewery itself, as an inquest reached the verdict that it had been an act of God, and the 8 people who had lost their lives had done so casually, accidentally, and by misfortune. Instead of paying restitution to the victims, Parliament decided that Mew and Company didn't have to pay excise tax on the beer that they had lost, saving the company from any kind of bankruptcy. Nothing went to the families. It's good to see that some things just never change. One good thing that did come from the incident was that they phased out the use of those big wooden vats, replacing them mostly with concrete vats. Now, oddly enough, this is not the only alcohol flood in history. There are several others that I won't be talking about today, but will definitely be making appearances in future drinking history videos. As for our beer punch, this is starting to simmer, so I'm going to finish up the eggs so we can try this out. Now once your eggs are nice and frothy, go ahead and add 2 ounces or about 60 milliliters of that rum, and then beat that in. Now I could probably do this all in this little bowl, but he says to serve it in punch glasses, so I'm going to mix it in this punch bowl very carefully. Take this out. So as you can see, the eggs nice and frothy, and very slowly, stirring the entire time, you're going to add the beer to...
Oh, you need to head out? Alright. Thanks for stopping by, Michael. Hope you had fun. I know I did. But yeah, thanks for being here. You do what you need to, and I'll see you some other time.
the eggs, stirring the entire time very, very slowly. You don't want scrambled eggs. Just a little bit at a time. If you pour it all in there at once, you're going to end up with little pieces of scrambled egg in your punch, and nobody wants that. A lot of people who made the butter beer, that's what they ended up with, and it's probably because I wasn't terribly specific in those early days with how slowly you had to do it. I can't remember, honestly, but go slow. And there we are. That's our beer punch. Let's give it a taste. As I said, he says to serve it in a punch glass. You could use it in, put it in like a mug or anything. Just make sure that it, since it's hot, it's something with a handle. It's so frothy, which I like. Though, I have to say, it's August when I'm recording this, the end of August, and it's like 90 degrees out. Not sure why I chose something hot beer to drink, but I did, so here we go. It's weird. It's good though. It's like, there's a creaminess. It's not an egginess. There's a creaminess to it. You can smell just a hint maybe of the egg, but it's more of the cinnamon. You get more of that cinnamon. Though I think this would be really good with even more spices in it. Add maybe some nutmeg or cardamom, maybe a little bit of clove, or just more cinnamon. Also, I think a big thing with this is what kind of beer you end up using, because that's of course the dominant flavor. That's the main ingredient. So using something like this works, a porter. I think like a chocolate stout or a vanilla flavored darker beer would be really, really nice. I'd probably steer away from something on the lighter side, like don't use a lager or pilsner or anything like that. But anyway, that's our beer punch, and it's perfect for the holidays, which are kind of coming up. So maybe hold off on making this one for a couple months, but eventually I think it's worth it. So make sure to follow me on Instagram, Tasting History with Max Miller, and I will see you next time on Drinking History. Now I need Christmas carols. It's August.
The beer flood. I need to look that up later for more detail. But yeah. Beer punch, beer flood. What are you gonna do about it? But yeah, that's gonna be all from me for today. So thank you everyone for stopping by. Hope y'all had fun. I know I did. But yeah, thanks for being here. Thank you to anyone watching the VOD, and thank you as always, the lovely fortune tellers watching this before I stream. Okie doke, let me see who's on right now so I can go raid. Ah, no one but the big shots. Decisions, decisions. No one I know is on right now, unfortunately. I was thinking, like, seeing if anyone was playing, like, Genshin, but given the new update, that's how everyone is playing Genshin, I imagine. GeoGuessr, let's go with GeoGuessr. Alright, let's go say hi to this person, I guess. Raid channel. Alrighty, but yeah. Thanks for being here, everyone. Remember to hydrate, rest up, eat tasty things, all that good jazz, and, peace!